The notion of the urban global south has emerged as an important conceptual term in contemporary planning debates about urbanization, development, and globalization. As a concept, it is both cause and consequence of unequal global and local power relations, manifested in urban politics that are acknowledged to be multiple, temporal, place-specific, and often in tension. Undoubtedly, it is a concept that demands constant reflection. Drawing on a wide range of views on cities in the urban global south, we reflect on this politics by returning to three simple questions. Why call it the urban global south? What kind of planning practices does it call for? What theory does it specifically beckon? To start then, why call it the urban global south?
I think that for me, this is a political question above all else. I think that the whole change from the language from developed countries to the third world to north-south reflects different historical moments around how countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America and the Middle East were perceived by the dominant countries of the north in their aid relationships, in their foreign aid and relationships. That early movement in, I think it was the early 1970s of the new international economic order was really presented as a non-aligned movement, as a first kind of political statement of countries of the south wanting to challenge the hegemony of the north in the way they viewed development and how they managed and controlled the flow of resources and money between the so-called north and south.
The group of 77 is the first group that organized under the banner of the South. And these are 77 countries in the developing countries which were saying, we are not going to do what you're asking us to do. Our interest has to be defended. But it was very much on the macroeconomy and trade, not on the city. So the scale of the conversation was very different. And I think the scale of the conversation matters, how we conceptualize things.
So I think one of the really interesting issues is to really think about why the term is being used, in what context, for what purpose, by whom, to be really clear about that and its implication. And of course, one of the inevitable issue when we're looking at that is the question of the demographics. It's quite clear, many figures tell us that the bulk of urban growth is going to be taking place in the urban global south. And what does that mean in terms of shifting urban imaginations? Up to now, they've been very much built around processes that are taking place in the so-called global north. And these patterns, these imaginations are going to become less and less relevant.
In addition to the north-south distinction, the term global has been added to capture the interdependencies and changing interconnections between different parts of the world. By situating the South in a global order, it becomes possible to highlight how interdependencies are changing and or remaining the same in the face of broader global changes.
I think it makes little sense to refer to an urban global south vis-à-vis an urban north. Of course, differences still exist, meaningful differences still exist between cities in one part of the world and in other parts of the world, but these differences are no longer of character, they are differences in nature. The city which were arising from the process of rapid urbanization in these countries were cities with clear differences. They were clearly different, diverse, I would say, from the city of the so-called advanced economies.
I wouldn't agree with the dualist perspective, particularly considering the complex, relational, networked and multiscalar processes that have accompanied the contemporary stage of internationalization and worlding. At the same time, the expression of the Global South indicates that these countries and their cities and regions have gone through different development trajectories, and that cannot simply be analyzed through the same analytical lenses that have been used for cities of the North. I believe a more open-ended, less mechanistic perspective of political economy that also allows for non-class-based processes of social spatial exclusion, and which is blended with constructivist views on the political and contested nature of scale and the urban South itself, would allow for a more promising agenda for research and transformative practice in the urban South.
I personally don't find it very helpful. I think the idea of calling a very, very large tract of people, geography, practices all in one group, yet claiming a need for thinking about diversity and locality, pulling them all under one heading, I don't find analytically very useful for my purposes. It is true that what it does provide is a telling difference from countries that we have called the North. And the North, at least in the vocabulary that I use, tends to represent parts of Western Europe, North America, and so on, which have very particular histories of planning and development.
We usually don't use this expression in Brazil, for instance. For instance, I don't use this expression because from my point of view, this view is typically an outsider view. I mean, the view of an European or maybe of an US American observer, true, but originally of a European observer for whom the world is more or less like a block. So you are putting in the same box realities which are very different economically, politically, and of course culturally.
I think the term urban global south is a misnomer because cities in the so-called urban global south differ immensely from each other. I do not think they can be all put together under the same brush. Cities in the developing world, I feel, would be a more appropriate term. Also, perhaps cities in the industrializing world. When you say developing, you are comparing it to something that is developed. I think that is very much the situation, and I don't think we should shy away from it.
Well, I think the concept of the Global South emerges as an opportunity to speak back to dominant urban theories. Now, the thing is that this is perhaps a useful strategy, but it, in my view, can only be an interim strategy. It's a strategy to stand for a moment, it's strategic, but it's essentializing. It's not necessarily taking forward an accurate engagement with theorization of the challenges and issues and potentials of cities around the world. Whenever we read people trying to make an argument about the Global South, we find them instituting many caveats. The Global South is in a dialectical relationship with the North. There are lots of lines of connection and cross-cutting processes. The Global South is multiple and instantiated in many different ways. It's partly because the Global South is an impossible category. We're trying to work with an inherited geopolitical motivation which does not have any actual empirical reality for the cities we're thinking about. And I would be much more inclined to go with all those caveats, to go with the multiplicity of locatedness, to go with the fragmentation of the forms of cities and planning, to go with the lines of connection, flows and circulation around cities. I think those are much more interesting starting points for a longer term way of theorizing and acting in cities which have very serious needs.
The idea of a dichotomous division between two worlds, north and south, is clearly not tenable empirically and not desirable politically or ethically. The point here is not to nitpick about when a particular term entered usage, but to stress that it's in some ways simply the latest in a whole series of terms that have sought to escape the compromise history of the term Third World. But of course, when they're not dichotomies, then they use explicit comparative terms like less, middle or more, which other people may find even more objectionable. So you can't really win. There is no perfect solution. In some ways, it's not entirely undesirable. One way in which I think it does have some sort of value is, for example, given the continuing overwhelming emphasis on Europe and North America by researchers in my discipline at least, terms like the Global South, the urban Global South, may perhaps serve to prick the conscience of those who otherwise simply blithely ignore the existence of other parts of the world with other histories.
Look, I mean, I think lots of people get kind of excited about whether there is or isn't such a thing as the Global South, and whether it's a useful term. And I'll use the term, but I'm not wedded to it. And the reason for me for using it is that it's political. The use of the term the Global South is political. It makes a statement about an under-researched area, an under-acted area. It's a way of being in the world rather than a fixed boundary and kind of physical identity.
I do realize that many scholars have become a bit obsessed about whether it's some kind of a baggage and whether we should resist it because it sets up new kinds of polarizations and binaries that might not be helpful. For me, it's a useful term, just in terms of positioning some of the cities that I research. So, what are the alternatives otherwise? We've gone through over the decades rejecting terms like third world cities, and you went in for the more policy related notion of less developed. It has a superlative notion, and in terms of the urban global south, what I like with it is that it doesn't have a superlative notion.
We have to start by acknowledging all the discomforts that such notion has created. I mean, of course, there are many criticisms about the risk of using it as a blanket term that pretends, that there is such a thing, an homogeneous entity called the urban global south. But I doubt anybody really using the term is that naive. I think that we can be reassured of that. And my personal view is that it is a potentially productive term. I can't think of any better short term to call upon a particular reality. And I think that is by far much better than any econometric understanding. It does help us in knowing that we are having here a short term that by which we can refer to the non-sameness of a part of the world, south, east, and there are many variations, that otherwise is systematically subordinated, both in intellectual and in practical terms.
Of course, as with all categories in the social sciences, they are useful to capture certain things, but at the same time, they're never complete and they never capture everything. What we're witnessing at the moment is the clash, if you will, between a market economic rationality and, of course, the unforeseen environmental impacts and extreme social impacts manifested specifically in very high levels of inequality and persistent poverty, predominantly outside of China, of course. So what this term, the Global South, does, it helps us to remind ourselves that there's a very specific set of historical processes that is unfolding at the moment and that finds its epicenter within the urban experience in the Global South.